Book 1 Section 10. M1 Junctions 1-44, A69 and A75. Our heroes said their goodbyes to Timmy Kinch and Hillary. A tense moment was spent between Graham and Hillary when he offered her a kiss that would leave their previous night's tomfoolery too much in evidence. Graham had deliberated for a reasonably large number of moments before launching with the lips as to how much reciprocation he would be likely to receive. Hillary did not seem the soppy sort, having made it clear that the duration of their liaison would be determined by the moment when the cock crowed. Still, he wanted to kiss her before he left, even if her desire to be kissed was non-existent. As he sat in the front seat of the newly bequeathed Audi A40, he pondered whether he wanted to kiss her because of what they had experienced, what he could possibly, or potentially feel for her, or simply so that Benny would know that he had been there and Benny hadn't, in the hope that that would rile him. Either way, Benny wasn't riled and Graham didn't get his kiss. The only probable byproduct of the incident would be Hillary spending some rather uncomfortable moments in the office. The seating arrangements in the vehicle were distributed thus. Front seat, driver, Benny. He had always enjoyed German engineering and was keen to compare the power and drivability of the Audi in comparison to the Beamers and VWs he had previously propelled. Next to Benny was Graham, considering his role in the organization as logistics and organizational expert warranting him the second best seat in the vehicle. He too wished for the opportunity to feel the response of the steering wheel, though was considered to be a substandard driver, even by Zippy, who didn't take to driving too well as a result of the general necessity to combine sobriety with conduction. This left the back seat to be occupied by Zippy and Gore, Zippy behind Benny so he could pull faces and pick his nose in the view of the rearview mirror, causing annoyance for the latter and pleasure for the former. Gore sat behind Graham so he would have a greater opportunity to orchestrate, though some would say manipulate, the music. Departure had been delayed a while in London as Gore could not decide on the CDs he wished to transport in the spare carry case for the car, and forced to stop just past Wembley to make some vital changes. This attitude was tolerated because they knew just how unpleasant he could become if his wishes were not granted. Not unpleasant in the sense that rudeness was an issue, merely he would detract himself even more than usual from the conversation and only grunt or tut when someone else made a selection that was an anathema to musical history. He would also come out with extreme phrases such "How can you sleep at night knowing that Hendrix, Joplin, Cole Porter and Francis Albert gave their lives gladly so that we can grow musically whilst you encourage the musical continuance of people like Wet Cubed and Simply Red." As has been mentioned before, Gore worried too much about these things. The boys, now armed with a new, unknown vehicle, though new to TK's open to liberal interpretation, this vehicle had seen little action but could not be described as recently unwrapped. It had less than 2,000 miles on the clock, and, despite it being about 10 grand less in value than the van they had exchanged it for, they were happy to have the wheels. TK had assured them that the car was clean, or at least not hot. Timmy used it for his own transport, as part of his permanent fleet, thereby making it bad business to use a stolen car for such purposes. He did stress, however, that he frequently paid very competitive prices for these vehicles, which came as no surprise to those present. The unidentified vehicle meant immunity from Colvin on the streets of Luton, and they could not resist a wee tour down the happy lanes of their youth, now saddened by the king of the thugs. They drove around the old estate and past Colvin's. Seeing the usual array of souped-up visual monstrosities parked outside, they knew they had done the right thing. Turning round, they went past Whittaker and Kelly's place and saw much less action. Zippy began to worry he might have killed them. Surely he hadn't given them that much. Graham asks if the combination of the sleep drug with the others, legal and illegal, may have enhanced the effects. Zippy confesses they hadn't considered that option. Once in a more salubrious area, they stopped to buy a local paper which does carry a story about two local lads who had been admitted to hospital after ingesting excessive quantities of a date rape-style drug. That must have given the nurses and the journalists a laugh, considered Benny, two of the ugliest lads in Luton, forced against their will, the women of today. It was considered that Colvin must know something or would do within a very short time frame. It was time to reduce their communications capacity. They transferred onto scraps of paper essential numbers from their mobiles. Graham sent a message to his mum saying that they were off to Devon to chill out for a few weeks and would be in touch. He also sent the same message to Paul Simmons, apologizing for being unable to provide him with merchandise for the time being, knowing that Simmons would take great delight in passing this information on to Colvin. They then bought 4 pay-as-you-go mobiles, paying cash, no information being handed over to the service operator as to the identities of the new proprietors, armed now with the capacity to communicate but not to be molested by those who should bother them with untimely questions. Whether Colvin would fall for the Devon line was not sure, but at least he wanted his mum to have something to offer him, should he call on her. He worried about leaving his parents to all this mess, but argued that they had talked about moving for years now. In some way, he hoped to be the catalyst for a new life for them, too. As they got outside Luton, it became clear that the journey was going to prolong, not just for the number of miles required to be driven to reach their point of call, but for the effects of being in an enclosed space with Zippy and Gore for too long. Gore had forgotten his anger about the music and was now ready to converse freely with Zippy. When they spoke together it was like a curious new language, not because of the unfamiliarity of the chosen lexicon, rather the improbable and seemingly pointless combinations in which the pair used them. Neither did they discuss normal things, instead choosing to combine incongruities aimed only at confusing or annoying the listeners, of which there were normally very few. Most of the time they were simply ignored and left to it, but even the spacious A40 gave no respite. This annoyed Benny greatly, which meant that it amused Graham and thus created a vicious circle of anger and mockery throughout the vehicle. They were less than 2 hours past Luton when the following conversation took place, which made it too much for Benny to cope with. "Okay, Gore. Favorite things about football?" was Zippy's opener. If you were expecting the answer to revolve around famous victories in '66 and the like, you were going down the wrong boulevard. When they decide to change halves at the toss-up. When the ball hits the corner flag but doesn't go out of play. Orange balls in the snow. When the camera focuses on a member of the crowd who is irate, who is shouting but lets out a drop of flob or snot by mistake. When Italian players have to cover their earrings with white tape, not plasters. Never plasters. Zippy has an opinion about the covering of jewelry with plasters and is against it. What about floodlight failure? I like it when someone makes a player laugh in the post-match interview. I also respect the person who decided to put more whoosh noises into the game as a televisual spectacle. This continued for a while, with a pair of them trying to classify these incidents in some sort of classification when they were inevitably sidetracked into a greater topic of conversation. Which characters in history, could be political or social, would be best represented by biscuits? For example, I have always considered that Mussolini would be well represented by a jammy dodger. Offered Zippy into the forum. There must be reasons. Gore inquired. There were, and a discussion followed about the likeness of Oreos to Michael Jackson, blue rubbers being like John Lennon, and penguins representing Anne Boleyn. When this moved on to questions about which soap star would enjoy which type of holiday more than another, Zippy actually had a theory why Dirty Den would enjoy a cycling holiday in the Dordogne more than Curly Watts. It became too much for Benny, who said he was putting the radio on. When Gore heard the suggestion of the radio, he fell into a deep depression at the thought that someone could enjoy that chart fodder in deference to his selections. The inane conversation stopped, and Benny suggested that Zippy, if he must talk, could tell the end of the Alan story. "But that's not a really jolly story," Zippy remarked. "Yes, but we have just passed a sign that says we are 18 miles from Leicester. Which means we have shitloads to go, and you will be thrown from this car if you two continue talking shite. Please tell the Alan story or say nothing." Benny was adamant. He placated Gore by saying he could drive after the next services, at the same time angering Graham. Zippy continued the story of Alan. Well, as you know, Alan had little or no time for the rules. He also had promised himself he would retire as a millionaire before the completion of his 30th spring. This was hurtling towards him, and the possibility of him retiring comfortably for the remainder of his time seemed little more than a rather infuriating joke. Alan continued to scheme towards the one great job that would net him enough to commence a new life away from Luton, somewhere sunnier, somewhere where he wouldn't need that much money and would be assured a return on his investment. He had decided on Cuba. The reasons for this decision were none too clear. Alan did not boast an excessive knowledge of geography. He would have been hard pushed to find Birmingham on a map. Still, Cuba it was, and the dream had to be realized. Alan was getting more and more desperate, although in the bars and clubs he still remained that happy-go-lucky character that everyone lapped up. Inside he felt time was running out. He didn't want to spend a Tony Matthews-style life, looking over his shoulder, awaiting the young pretender to come and steal the throne. He wanted out, and quick. That said, we continued to do the odd job together, although it was clear that Alan's motivation for sport had waned. We were on the brink of saying goodbye to the birthday jobs for good when he came to us with a plan. It was his birthday a few days after he came to us and said that he had found a place that was so poorly guarded that it was almost embarrassing how easy it was going to be. After scratching the surface, it turned out that it wasn't really going to be that easy, but still, within our capabilities. Apparently, in a warehouse on the outskirts of Luton lay bags of cash frequently left unattended. Alan decided that a number of these, to be determined by the amount we could carry, were in fact his property. Graham couldn't see how it could be so easy, but the recce missions did offer the potential thief more than a modicum of good feeling. From time to time there were people who looked burly enough to cause concern, never more than 3 though, and the 5 of us could surely inflicted a superior damage ratio to them. And so, despite reservations, we concluded that work with the man Matthews had lost its edge and was so dreary, mainly due to a ridiculous level of police protection. Me and Benny would take clothes into the stations on special orders. At times, if the sizes were wrong, a police car would take us back to the lockup and change them. For that reason it might be a bit of a laugh to get back in with Alan, as long as things were done properly. It was the first time we had worked together on his birthday. As soon as we met to go to the warehouse, something was different about him. He had always thrived on the energy of the pre-job ride, adrenaline rushing through his system, the camaraderie of the gang and the thought of the loot. This time we all just sat in the car in semi-silence, wondering when the fun was going to start. It took about 10 minutes to drive out of town and get to the warehouse. We parked up and, as expected, saw no other vehicles in the forecourt. We exited the vehicle and Alan told us to wait. He was changing the plans a bit. He never saw Graham as much of a battler and wanted him behind the wheel and controlling the mobiles, should things go off. Remember, these are the days of relative mobile infancy, none of the luxury features you see nowadays, just an apparatus to speak to people on. Seems absolutely ludicrous in retrospect, doesn't it? Benny questioned this, suggesting that there would probably be no one inside, therefore, more hands carry more bags of loot. Alan insisted that one never knew and opened the boot to pull out an enormous, and, what looked to be, very sharp machete. Now everyone took a step back and pulled out the old QUSCXCS lines. Alan said it was a little bit of extra insurance and was halfway in before our instincts could vainly attempt to convince our bodies not to follow suit. To cross the 100 meters that separated the car from the door took less than a minute, as would be expected, though with the machete glimmering from the evening sun, every step appeared to be taken through a meandering stream of marmalade laced with superglue. Once inside, swift work it was to find the loot, and realize that this could be the job Alan had talked of for so long. Perhaps, for this reason his nerves were more than apparent. We grabbed a bag each and tried to do a weight cash guess, a rather tricky ask when you don't know if there are 5s, Ayrtons or Snorty specials inside the bag. Actually, we didn't really know if it was money inside, maybe it was cut up bits of last night's standard, we didn't have time to check. We just enjoyed that brief moment in the silence. Then it came to us, then we started to listen to the silence, then we started to hear it. It wasn't a normal silence. For a start, there was too much of it. That much silence cannot be real, and as we stood, frozen with the bags in our hands, broken was our friend the silence. To this day, I will never understand why they, after waiting to catch us red-handed, came out of the door, brandishing baseball bats and screaming as they ran towards us. The moment has even made me contemplate religion. I have a profound desire to praise the Lord, God Almighty, for making these villains stupid enough to run at us screaming. I thought that only happened in the films, but it gave us the 10 meters we needed. We made light with our feet, which were made heavy by the bags in our hands. Decision time had knocked on our door. With the bags we would not make it to the car. We hadn't even considered the fact that there would be other goons waiting outside the door. Surely that would not be cricket. Could anyone be such a bad sport? Alan was losing about a meter a second with the machete as well as the bag of cash. The call came to drop the bags, and we made it to the door. I dared not look back in case I lost my footing and turned into a blonde nymphette from a straight-to-video horror flick. Once outside, we saw the car and Graham managed to capture the message without the need for digital communication devices. With no time for comedy, the car started first time and Graham slid over to open the doors, a nice touch indeed in such a hairy moment. In further testament to our chase's stupidity, they stopped in their tracks as they came into the open air, realizing their vehicle was on the other side of the building. We got in and sped off, still charged on the rush, but unable to contain the laughter as we saw good our escape. Triumphantly, Alan leaned out the window, brandishing the machete and offering expletives to the losers we had just left behind. Graham struggled to maintain control of the vehicle between giggles and told Alan to haul himself in. As we went through the main gate there was a little knock on the small wall seemingly put there for no good reason, but we were on the open road, and it would appear free. After the moment died down we went into that post-euphoric moment, when the thrill of the chase has gone and you were left with your mind reminding you of how close you had come, once again, to doing your final job, the adrenaline having now departed their system, left to assimilate your accomplishment in the privacy of your domain, away from the cameras. The moment seems already etched in history, and the initial feelings of ecstasy are replaced by a confusing emptiness and the knowledge that the moment will never be repeated. Thus, we sat in the vehicle for a good couple of minutes as Graham made time, all of us unsure which words would serve to resume communications. It wasn't until Benny leaned forward to suggest a shortcut that he felt a sharp pain in his knee, and we realized that the nightmare was far from over. Somehow, as he pulled himself back into the passenger seat, Alan did so still brandishing the machete, and in a way that could probably only be repeated one time in a million. Just as we had that little knock against the wall, Alan must have slid forward and drove the machete straight through his stomach. He can't have taken long to die. As our glance switched to the floor of the motor, there was already a pool of what used to be Alan's sanguine life force covering the carpet. Our immediate dilemma was that we could not stop. This was the only road going back into town. We had to find a detour, then make a plan. We knew that the solution lay with Tony Matthews, but were none too enamored with the idea of making that call. The police could be called. Who would believe this was an accident? Also, the press angle might have a negative impact on our non-amorous suitors. We found our way off the track that had been beaten and looked to pull over somewhere relatively safe, Alan's impaled corpse still rooted to the passenger seat. It is hard to drive with a dead friend in the car, and inevitably the moment began to take its toll. This is morose. I need a smoke. Gore was the first to speak as he extracted a fresh deck of lights. Shit. Has anyone got a light? He asked the group. To this day I don't know why, but this seemed to be the most appropriate thing to say. I think Alan has. At first it did not look like I would be getting any comedy awards, and I tried to make amends. Sorry, that may have been in rather poor taste. As I had almost finished the sentence the car was in laughter from all but one occupant. We got to some abandoned woods and pondered when we would next laugh as it was decided that Graham should make the call. It is not clear that whether I, or Benny, had made that call, Tony's reaction would have been any different. It was assumed that Graham had a special bond with him, that he respected Graham more because he wasn't just a thick thief. Matthew's displeasure was registered and we knew that later we would amortize the debt, but at the time heads had to be clear to dispose of the evidence. Disposing of cadavers is not one of our fortes, so Tony's input was appreciated. The plan was rather simple. As long as it looked like suicide, then the police were keen to put it down to just that. Matthews did make it quite clear that he did not like using up favors on such a joker. His feelings on Alan were well known. We could be up for the underworld equivalent of the sack. Sure, our work rate was good, but we could be liabilities. Anyway, that would have to be addressed after disposal. Tony Matthews seemed far too comfortable around death. We knew that people die in our line of work with more regularity than they do in, say, the post office or chartered accountancy, but shootings were still more the order of the day than assassinations. We were never prepared for death. Death never calls ahead with his flight itinerary, and husbands are never asked by wives if they have put up the camp bed with an extra blanket for death in that oh-so-cold spare room. Instinct ruled our actions as we put the fact that Alan had left this earth from our mind. We had work to do. Matthews inquired as if to whether the implement which had caused the fatality was still in the victim. It was. He then said that we would have to get him into the driver's seat and somehow get him to drive into a tree with enough force to cause the car to explode. Keep it simple, boss. The most unpleasant part was shifting the body from the passenger seat to the driver's. Then we had to find a way to get him to drive into a few nice birches that were on the other side of the road. All this without being seen. The first attempt didn't go too well. We got him driving towards the trees with Benny holding his leg onto the accelerator and him jumping out as a certain amount of speed was built up. Inevitably, the speed was not enough to cause an explosion as the car hit the tree, not full on as his hands had slipped from the steering wheel, and made a dull, uninspiring thud. Indeed, a louder noise came from Benny's shoulder as it was dislocated upon impact with the ground. We tried again, this time from further out and with Alan's right hand on the accelerator and his left foot tied to the steering wheel to keep it steady. We didn't have enough string for both hands. We managed to get him up to a good 20 miles per hour before impact. The thud was better, but the naughty vehicle still refused to explode. Third time lucky was discussed before Benny thought a dickens with this and decided to light an oily rag and dump it in the petrol tank as the motor plodded to the now heavily abused Birch. This time she blew and we made it on foot, taxis verboten, to the petrol station where Matthew's boys awaited us. The first thing we were asked was if we had completed the task as requested. We told them we had and for some strange reason looked at them like we expected some sort of commendation. The showdown with Matthews would be later. We were allowed to stay for the funeral, on condition that we say nothing about that night. All feeling ready to be swallowed into Beelzebub's lair as we tried to converse with Alan's distraught widow who held herself in some way responsible for the ultimate decision taken by her husband. After that, we had more pressing issues to worry about. Matthews would need to use up another favour as the lads we were trying to rob now knew who we were and that we worked for Matthews. This was considered a gross infringement of the code of conduct which regulated patches. We would need to disappear for a while and let things cool down, knowing that some form of community service would be required upon our return. To remedy the wrong we had done to our rivals, we will have to be at their disposal for a short while. So, we were sent off to Greece the next day, pay suspended, on a party island with no desire to party, waiting for the call to come back or wandering with our grave by the Aegean Sea or the Thames. So that was Alan, gallant, gracious, raconteur, comic, uncontrollable, universally adored and even in death, a conversation piece. Every thief in Luton lost a little something that day, but when we remember him, we do so fondly, reliving the continuous joy that he gave us in the brief time he was in our lives, knowing that we were blessed to have been given the moments we should now cherish in his memory for many moons will pass before we meet another of his ilk. May you rest in peace, causer of trouble, robber of items and perpetrator of joy. As Zippy finished the tale, the dry eyes in the car were few in number as they entered the Caledonian kingdom of the Celts. At Junction 16 they turned off and made for their highland retreat of Marlott, choosing the first decent place that they found in the town.